Okay, we're going to be looking at the first of the literary movements, and that is the classical period. And the classical period, anybody know what the classical period in Western civilization is? What two cultures it encompasses? It's ancient Greece and Rome. And the world for the ancient Greeks and the Romans is much different than it is for not only modern people, but even for the Middle Ages. And I've set these up in contrasting pairs wherever I can, so that classical and medieval are almost exactly the opposites of one another. One is largely intellectual, the other is largely emotional. The classical period has got its emotional time too, early on. When a culture starts out, in its very beginnings, will it tend to be more intellectual and organized and filled with rules and structured, or will it tend to be more emotional?
More emotional.
It'll be more emotional. When we get to drama, you'll see that drama starts out being ritual magic. Almost all the things in the Greek theater. And I'll hold this until we do Oedipus the King, but it really starts out in the emotional early stages of the culture. The longer the culture goes on, the more intellectual it gets. The more organized, the more rules that it has. And then eventually, it starts to fall apart. And when it starts to fall apart, it gets more emotional again. And you'll see that happen with both the Greeks and the Romans. For the classical world, life is no picnic. Things don't center around individuals. They don't center around human beings, in fact, at all. Anybody know what religion dominates the ancient world, at least in the West, Greece and Rome?
Polytheism.
Paganism.
Paganism?
Yeah, polytheism is like paganism. There's a god for everything. The gods, the structure of the world basically has three parts to it. The gods are at the top, men are in the middle, animals are at the bottom. Human beings' only value is that they are a form of entertainment for the gods. The world doesn't run for people. It runs for the gods. And people are just here as a kind of entertainment, a kind of a soap opera that they watch. They know how everything is going to turn out in our lives. And they find it enormously funny to see us struggle against these obstacles. They can make changes in the way things are going to turn out for us, but they almost never change them for the good, because they don't find that particularly interesting when we're happy. They're basically happy when we're miserable and we're struggling against these obstacles that we can't possibly overcome, or when we think good things are happening to us. And they know that ultimately they're not. For example, sense of irony. When we look at the drama, we'll see this even more so. But there's a movie a while back called La Bamba, and it's about the day that three rock and roll singers got onto an airplane and it crashed and they died. And everybody knows when they watch that movie that that's what happens. These people die in the end. But they just had a hit record, the tour's going good, and the guy's on the phone with his girlfriend talking about what they're going to do when he gets back. We know it's never going to happen. That's the position of the gods. The gods find it enormously funny when we're happy about how good our life is going and we're making all these elaborate plans for what we're going to do, when they know what we're going to do, and it's almost never what we think we're going to do. Probably a good example of that is that whatever your major is, the odds are that you won't be working in it when you get out of here. College students generally change their major 4 times before they get out anyway, of a four-year school. And the odds are you won't, unless maybe if you're a teacher or if you're in nursing or medicine, you might end up doing what you thought you were going to do. But almost everything else, you end up doing something other than what you trained for. And the gods know that. So that when you're standing in line and puzzling over your schedule and you're so happy because you got this course that you really needed, and the gods are laughing because you're never actually going to use that course ever in your life. You just think that you are. And they find that enormously funny. The world is pretty miserable for human beings. And there isn't anything really to look forward to. And you'll see a big contrast with this in the Middle Ages. When you die in the Greek world, you're here as the toys of the gods, and then you die, and there's not much to look forward to after death. There are the Elysian fields, which is kind of paradise. But it's never clear what you have to do to get there. Everybody else ends up in Hades. Hades is not hell. Hades is simply the land of the dead. It's like this big, enormous bus station where everybody waits, and they don't feel anything anymore. And anytime somebody like Achilles or Ulysses ends up in the world of the dead, they flock around him immediately, and they want to know what's happening to all the people they know, and they just yearn for sensation again, and they really want to be alive again, and they stay there in this boring place until it gets so intolerable that they drink from the river Lethe, they forget that they ever lived, and then they come back again as a human being in the same setup where everything runs for the gods. So the best you get is to die and come back into the same miserable world that you died out of the first time.
Is that like reincarnation?
Yes. It's not reincarnation, for example, in the way Hinduism looks at reincarnation, where everything you do in this life builds up a debt, positive or negative, and you come back in your next life and have to pay off your negatives and try to stack up some positives. And generally you keep screwing up, so you have to keep coming back. In this one, you don't have to come back. You could stay in Hades for eternity. In most reincarnations, you automatically come back whether you want to or not, because that's the process. But for the Greeks, you had a choice. You could stay in Hades, but nobody ever does, because it just gets so boring. And the further you go from life, it's like as you get old, you look back and you think of things were really great when you were 17, because you only remember the good parts. I mean, being 17 was largely a nightmare, even if you did pretty well, because there were so many things that were confusing and so much stuff you didn't know, and a lot of insecurities and stuff that you had, but you don't remember any of that. You only remember the good stuff. So the longer you're in Hades, the more you remember the good things about being alive, until you've forgotten all of the misery that's part of it, and then you drink from the river Lethe and you come back again. And I don't know whether when you come back, you go, oh no, it's the same crummy place I left 100 years ago. I don't think you do. I think when you forget everything. So that when you're born, you think that you're new. Plato believes in the transmigration of souls, that you leave your body and you come back. You go through this cycle. Except he believed, I'm pretty sure, that you didn't necessarily come back as a person. You might come back next time as a dog or a cow or anything. But then, even if you did come back as an animal, you end up sooner or later with that body dying, and then you got to either wander around with no body, or you end up go back down to Hades and stay there for a while until you get bored with it and come back again. But it's not very optimistic, and it's not much to look forward to. For the classical world, life is tough, and death isn't much better. And there isn't much of anything to look forward to. And if you accept that, you might wonder, well, why, if anybody believed that, why wouldn't they just cut their throat? I mean, this doesn't seem to work out very well for anybody. And the Greeks said, you don't cut your throat because you apply the intellect. You can't get out of this box. I mean, you can get out of it for a little while, but you come back to it anyway. So you might as well stay alive in the life that you have. If you let your emotions run things, life is going to be a torment to you. Most of the classical philosophies, like Stoicism, preach what they called the golden mean. And what they meant was to try to stay in this middle range. Never, to the Stoic, you never want to love anything so much that you can't live without it. And you never want to hate anything so much that you die to get rid of it. You never want to own something that's so valuable to you that you couldn't stand the loss of it. So you have to live your life detached from things, and especially detached from your emotional experiences. Love is okay, but only in this golden mean. You never want to get really, really carried away. And of course what happens is you miss the ecstasies of life, but you also miss the agonies. Now the only way to keep an emotional equilibrium is if you apply the intellect. It's only the intellect that can keep you from getting carried away. So that when you're feeling really, really good about the world, your intellect ought to step in and remind you that nobody has a run of good luck that lasts forever. And conversely, when things are going really bad and you're looking around for a straight razor in a vein, your intellect ought to step in and say, look, this is the worst it's ever been. How much worse can it get? Once we get over this, the rest of life's got to be a piece of cake, because it'll never get this bad again. So hang on. Besides, no run of bad luck ever lasts forever. So your intellect is supposed to step in and intervene, and almost all of their philosophies say the same thing. Use your intellect. Let your intellect be in charge of your emotions. When you let your emotions in control, they run amok. They'll bring you to a bad end. Yes, you will miss the great joys, but you won't ever get broken by life. And in a world where things don't run for people, where they run for the gods, who find human misery amusing, what are the odds on you having a perfectly happy life anyhow? Zero. Everybody's going to come across some tragedy. Most of us are going to come across a lot of tragedy. If you don't know that going in, the first one or the second one or the third one will break you. But if you know it, if you use your intellect, when the tragedy comes, it'll hurt, but it won't destroy you. And so the classical period focuses on this idea of using your intellect. And they saw philosophy as the way to do that. Philosophy keeps reminding you, almost all their philosophies say the same thing, put the intellect in charge. Don't let your emotions rule. Don't be subject to your emotions, because life is largely tragic, and if you're the victim of your emotions, you're going to be destroyed. It's not all that easy to do. We're emotional beings. It's hard to put the intellect in control. And so most of their poetry and most of their work tells you that you've got to accept the way things are and live with it, because you can't change it. The world doesn't run for you, it runs for the gods. Since that can't be changed, you have to learn some way to live with it. And the way to live with it is by putting your intellect in charge. So that when you look at the characteristics of the classical period, the very first thing you see is the dominance of reason. The intellect is the most important thing. It's the thing they valued above all else. They also wanted their works to be objective. If you're not going to be overwhelmed by your life, you have to be able to stand apart from it. That's one of the things that will keep you from being swallowed up by your emotions. Looking at your life objectively. In other words, you go out to get in your car and somebody has crashed into it, your insurance lapsed yesterday, and it won't even run without being fixed. And you're really upset. Not only would you kill whoever ran into it if you could find them, but you're really in despair. This is the worst thing that could possibly happen. Things are terrible. Well, the Greeks would say not, if you look at it objectively. The worst thing is you were standing there fixing your headlight when the guy backed into it, and he ran into you and left your body bleeding there in the parking lot along with your smashed up car. Things could be a lot worse. You're upset because you can't get your car fixed. There are people who have to walk everywhere they go. And they're walking around looking for food, whereas you've got a full belly. In other words, when you stand objectively apart and look at your miseries, they don't seem nearly as bad as the worst possible case. And so that's going to help you get through them. So they want their works to be objective as well. They don't want the author telling you about his personal life as an example of what it is he's talking about. They will use their own personal experience, but not as the focus. In other words, a classical writer may tell you something that happened to him to illustrate a point. But the focus won't be on what happened to him. In other words, what he's really trying to tell you is, this is how I got over losing all my money. Not, this is what it feels like to have had everything and then to have lost it. This is the despair that you feel. This is the worthlessness that you feel. It doesn't focus on that. It uses the event as an example of something else. And what they're trying to tell you to do is use your intellect. Think about things. They want things to make sense. Most of the time, especially when we look at classical poetry, the poem is going to give you useful advice. That's what they thought poetry was for. That's what they thought philosophy was for. To give people useful advice so they don't get overwhelmed by life. Restricted scope. If you're going to give people advice, you want to give them advice on everything that you know? No. I mean, think of the last time somebody gave you advice. They're going to tell you all about everything, how you ought to live your life. It takes hours. After the first 2 minutes, you stop listening. So if you're going to give people advice, you want to limit it. Don't tell people about love in general. Tell them what to do when they get dumped. That's enough. Focus on one thing. Don't try to deal with everything there is. Try to pick out one subject. Try to get that subject small enough that you can say something intelligent about it in a relatively short period of time while you can maintain people's attention. So their works don't go off in all directions, as you'll see the medieval works do. Instead, they try to focus in on one little bit of advice that they want to give you. Mostly, they give you the same advice. The advice is restraint and moderation. For the classical world, there wasn't anything that was all that bad if you only did a little bit of it. It was only when you go to the extremes that things become dangerous. Love is fine. Being in love is fine. But being so in love with somebody that you can't stand to be away from them for 5 minutes is not fine. Being angry is fine. Even hating somebody's okay. But when you hate somebody so much that all you think about is how you can get even with them, it eats up your life. All your life becomes is a vendetta. And you don't get to enjoy anything. All it is plots to get even. So hatred, it's not the thing that's wrong. It's the extremes that are wrong. So they'll preach moderation most of the time, staying within these simple bounds. Simplicity of form. If you're going to give people advice, you want to give advice to a lot of people. The more complex you make the form of what you do, the harder it is to follow. Well, what's that got to do with people getting your advice? They can't understand your poem. They can't take your advice. So you want to make it simple. Unity of aim and design. They thought you should pick out one thing that you were going to do with that work, and that's what it ought to do. It shouldn't try to do all kinds of things. For example, when we look at, from reading Oedipus, that's a tragedy. A tragedy to the classical world ought to be tragic all the way through. How many places were there in Oedipus where you laughed out loud? None. I would order a psychiatric evaluation for you if there had been a whole lot of them. He starts out at the high point of his life and he goes down to the worst possible point in his life. It's a disaster. It's a 3-hour car wreck. Well, that's what it ought to be, the classes said. You don't want to if you're trying to show people a tragic thing, which as you'll see Oedipus brings on himself, you don't want people laughing in the middle of that. If you've got a serious thing to tell people, don't make them laugh. On the other hand, if you're trying to amuse them, don't scare them. And don't bring them heavy-duty thoughts that they got to stop and ponder over. Make them light. In other words, decide what it is you want to do with your work, and have everything in that work ought to go towards what it is you try to do. If you're doing a tragedy, then everything in it should be tragic. It should go towards making people feel sorry and regretful. Clarity. No point in giving people advice if it's not clear. So the advice should generally be pretty simple. And you should be able to phrase it simply. You shouldn't deal with all of the minute details and counter arguments. In other words, you want to give somebody advice, you don't give them a whole lot of on the other hands. You could do this or this or this or this or that and give them 20 choices. All you do is confuse them. Instead, you want to give people advice, you limit the advice, and that's all you do. You just give them that piece of advice. And you do it as clearly as you possibly can. They believed in balance. Emotional balance, that's that golden mean, living in the middle. And that emotional balance spilled over into everything else they did. So much so that you can even see it in their architecture. You know what a Greek temple looks like, right? With columns and all. There's almost never an uneven number of columns. And in fact, when you look at their poetry, generally they'll have an even number of lines and an even number of stanzas. They like things to come out even. If they have one ornament, if you got one on the right, you got to have one on the left. If you've only got one, where does it go?
In the middle.
Right in the middle. Everything has to be balanced. Everything should be proportional to everything else. In their statuary, they had at its height, the golden mean was even applied to sculpture. They wanted things to be realistic. But on the other hand, they wanted to have this perfect proportion and balance as well. So that if you did a sculpture, the ratio between the head and the body and the torso ought to be 1 to 1.5. And the ratio between the eyes and the face ought to be 1 to 1.5. They had this mathematical relationship that the parts of the composition were supposed to adhere to. And even if the thing looked like, let's say you decided to do a statue of Julius Caesar, and you made it look like somebody had dipped them in bronze. It was that lifelike. They would still look at it and say, this is an awful statue. Look at it. Its head is way too big for its body. It's like Michael Dukakis. And you might say, but that's what Caesar looked like. He was a little short guy with a really big head. They would say, it doesn't matter. You got to shrink the head. You have to have that proportion between the size of the head and the size of the body, between the size of the body and the size of the limbs. And it has to come out mathematically even. So balance persisted into just about everything that they did. And again, it reflects that emotional balance, which is what they want everybody to be striving for. Sequential organization, things ought to go step by step. So you start out saying, this is what I'm going to prove. Here's some examples of it. I'm right. Or you say, here's an example, and here's an example, and here's an example, and what can we draw from that? And then you give your generalization. Everything's set up in the form of a logical argument. Reasonable and step by step. Sequential organization because it's easy to follow. If you're going to tell a story, you want to tell it chronologically. One thing happened after another thing happened after another thing. You don't want to jump all around back and forth. There's a small contradiction to that in Aristotle, where Aristotle says in medias res, begin in the middle. Actually, begin as close to the end of your story as you can. Start the action of your story, and then if you need to, fill in the background as you go along. But don't start out, if you're going to tell about the war with Troy, don't start out with the hero, and I was born. And then go all through his childhood, and then in his teenage years, and work his way up, and so that 600 pages later, you finally get to the battle. Start with the battle. If there's something about his childhood that's relevant to that, you can bring it in, but only as you go along. And once you start close to the battle, then go sequentially. Chasteness of style means that you're not elaborate, you're not flamboyant. Remember, they don't like the extremes. So you don't want to take anything in the story to the extreme. And you don't want to take, just the way you don't want to take anything in your life to an extreme. You want to be moderate in all things. Ultimately, they're preaching self-control, so self-control appears in all their works. The work itself will be controlled. You can tell that the author was arranging these ideas in a particular way, that he wanted them to come out towards a particular end. And that's the way he thinks that life ought to be. You ought to be in control of yourself. Decorum is proper behavior, the way things are supposed to be done. And decorum is the way that people have successfully done things in the past. So it tells you already that you don't have to make all of these mistakes for yourself. If you do what's proper, the way things are usually done, it'll usually come out right. It has in the past. They're traditional. They tend to do things the same way. Elaboration and newness. Newness breaks the rules. In order to do a novel thing in a work, you have to do it the way things haven't been done in the past. And so you have to break the rules for the way things have been done. Once you start breaking rules, the classicists all they get upset. Because that's how you control yourselves, with the rules. If anybody can break the rules whenever they want, then everything falls apart. The example that's given there is the Homeric epithet. And what that is it's a little phrase that's used over and over. For example, whenever the sun comes up in Homer, it's never the sun. It's always rosy-fingered dawn. No matter what ocean they sail on, it's always the wine-dark sea. He's always wily Ulysses. It's always brave Achilles. Sometimes there are whole paragraphs that get repeated like that.